Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. There are times when God is doing something in our life that we may not understand, we may not even want. And yet God has a sovereign reason for why that thing is in our life. And today in our study of Genesis 37, we'll see that's exactly the situation for Joseph's life. So welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. My name is Russ Brewer, and I am pastor at Wellington Community Church in Wellington, Colorado. And this is our daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of the Bible, one chapter per day, to understand what that passage says and how it fits in the overall Word of God. Now, today as we look at Genesis 37, in last year's study through Genesis, we skipped over this passage, the whole life of Joseph. And at the time, it was just because Joseph's life is 13 chapters in the Bible. It's a ton of time. And yet, as I think about Joseph's life and its importance to what's coming up in Exodus, I think we need to add these chapters to our study. In fact, Joseph is a major figure in the Old Testament. 13 chapters are dedicated to his life in the book of Genesis. Genesis records more dialogue from Joseph than any other person in the Old Testament. The material dedicated to Joseph's life actually exceeds the material dedicated to Abraham's life by 25%. Not only that, there are key similarities between Joseph and Jesus. Both suffered according to the divine plan of God. Both were faithful to their appointed tasks, and both achieved the salvation of their people. Scholars classify Joseph as a type of Christ. We mentioned the other day that the word type is a theological term that refers to something in the Old Testament that foreshadows Jesus or teaches about him. And as we study Joseph's life, we will see that he foreshadows the coming of our Lord. And so with that, let's start in the opening verses of Genesis 37 and look at the setting of Joseph's childhood. Genesis 37 really begins talking about Jacob. And it says, "Now Jacob lived in a land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan." Now, in yesterday's podcast, we talked about Jacob's shenanigans where he deceived his father Isaac and stole the family birthright from his slightly older brother Esau, and how that ended up with him having to run for his life. We had to skip over the next several chapters of what happened next, but to make a long story short, after Jacob deceived his father Isaac, Jacob went up to the land of Haran where his mother's brother Laban lived. When Jacob arrived, he quickly met Laban's daughter named Rachel. Now, Jacob was so smitten with her, he could only kiss her and cry. You can check that out for yourself in Genesis 29:11. Apparently, that was the way to Rachel's heart. And pretty soon, Jacob was working for his uncle Laban so he could marry Rachel. Well, he worked for Laban for 7 years, and finally they were allowed to get married. But on their wedding night, Laban swaps out Rachel for her older sister Leah. Not cool. Somehow Jacob doesn't notice this and things go on, and it's just not a cool situation. And so he complains to Laban, and Laban's like, well, don't worry, give it a week, you can marry Rachel as well. And so he does, and inside of 8 days, Jacob goes from being a bachelor to having 2 wives. Things get even weirder, though, and eventually Jacob marries their maids Bilhah and Zilpah, who are called wives in verse 2 of our chapter today, chapter 37. And between these 4 women, Jacob has 12 sons plus some daughters. Now, you can imagine that having a father-in-law who would swap out your bride for her sister, that's not a recipe for a great relationship. And although Jacob does stay with Laban for 20 years, things were never all that great. And finally, then, in Genesis 31, verse 3, the Lord tells Jacob to head back home to where he grew up. Now, Jacob obeys the Lord. He heads on out. He has a rocky departure with Laban, but a surprisingly good homecoming with Esau, and he ends up living in Canaan, which now brings us to chapter 37. In verse 1, again, it says that Jacob's living in the land of Canaan. This is the area that would later be called the Promised Land or Israel. And then in verse 2, we get a window into the environment that Joseph grew up in. Jacob's got these 12 sons. There's some daughters there. The problem is that Joseph's mom, Rachel, had died back in Genesis 35. And not only that, we don't know exactly when Leah died either, but perhaps that was before Genesis 37 too. And so Joseph is basically alone. He's got his kid brother Benjamin, but he's got these 2 or 3 stepmoms, 10 older brothers, and in verse 2 they bring a bad report to Jacob against him. Now Jacob's home was basically out of control. Back in Genesis 35, Jacob's oldest son Reuben slept with Jacob's concubine wife Bilhah. And not only that, Jacob showed extreme favoritism to Joseph, and this just led to a massive sibling rivalry, and we see this in our text in verse 3. Verse 3 says that Jacob loved Joseph more than the rest of his sons, and so his other sons were bitter against him. And verse 4 says his brothers saw that their father loved him, Joseph, more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. And so now all of this sets the scene for Joseph's dysfunctional childhood. He's got 2 or 3 stepmoms. Practically all of his brothers came from different mothers. There's this huge range of ages. His dad is clueless to the problems he's creating. And although he pours special blessings upon Joseph, those blessings only to serve the cause of his brothers to hate him, this is a tough situation for anyone to overcome. And to make matters worse, in verse 3, Jacob gives Joseph a coat of many colors. Now this coat was an extraordinary piece of clothing. The King James says it was a coat of many colors. The NIV is probably a bit closer when it calls it a richly ornamented robe. If you have the NAS, your margin note calls us a full-length robe. It was literally a garment that had sleeves that reached all the way down to the hands. Its length would reach all the way down to the feet. It wasn't a colorful windbreaker. It was a full-length robe. It was a robe of dignity. David's daughter Tamar wore a robe like this in 2 Samuel 13, and she was a daughter of a king. She's a princess. And so in this world of nomadic herdsmen, everyone else is wearing utilitarian work clothes, but Joseph is walking around robed in glory. They're all wearing Carhartts, and Joseph's got his tux on. It was a distinction that everyone noticed, and it probably showed the family that Joseph, who at this point is now a young man, he's the chosen one who would receive the family inheritance, and so his brothers hated him for it. This situation with the robe is the first of many in Joseph's life where God uses something that seems relatively insignificant to redirect Joseph's life to accomplish God's purposes for him. And so this coat brought his brothers' bitterness to a flashpoint, and their bitterness was ignited when Joseph told them about his grandiose dreams. In chapter 37, Joseph had 2 dreams. In verses 5 through 7, Joseph dreamed that his brother's wheat bowed to his wheat. Now, he tells them about this, and in verse 8, they're not very impressed. And then in verse 9, Joseph dreamed that even the stars and the sun and the moon bowed to him. Now, everyone understood the implications of this dream, and in verse 10, even his parents are annoyed. And so Joseph has these dreams, and for those who know how the story ends, we know that those dreams were prophetic, that there would be a day when his family would bow down to him. But that wouldn't come about through a life of ease, but through adversity. And this adversity begins in verse 18. In verse 18, Joseph's looking for his brothers who were far from home. They lived in the valley of Hebron. And in verse 13, Jacob sent Joseph to look for his brothers in Shechem. Now, Shechem's about 50 miles north of home, but when he gets there in verse 17, someone tells him his brothers have moved on to Dothan, which is another 50 miles north. So Joseph heads up that way. When he finds them, they are 65 miles from home. His brothers see Joseph coming towards them, and they concoct a plan to kill him. Perhaps they figured that if Joseph was dead, they could split the inheritance 10 or 11 ways. And so they're going to kill him. But in verse 21, Reuben convinces them not to kill Joseph, just throw him in a pit, and he's going to come back later and rescue him. Now, this momentary decision changes the history of the Jews. And so they keep Joseph alive, and instead of killing him, they decide to sell him as a slave to some Ishmaelites. Now, you might recognize the name Ishmaelite because these are the descendants of Ishmael. Remember, Ishmael was Isaac's half-brother who was born to Hagar, who was sent from Abraham's house back in Genesis 21. So we're really not all that far from that event. Ishmael was Jacob's step-uncle, and these guys here are something like half-cousins or something like that. And so in verse 28, they sell him for 20 shekels of silver, which is about 8 ounces, and the Ishmaelites take Joseph off to Egypt. Now, this is a pretty awful situation. Joseph grew up in a home of chaotic preferential treatment. He's surrounded by a mob of bitter brothers who hated him so much they want to kill him. And the blessings he received from his father fueled his brothers' hatred, so they sell him to slave traders. And in their mind, he's finally good as dead. And so they're so certain they would never see him again, they dipped his robe in goat's blood and brought it to Jacob and said, "What do you think? Is this Joseph's robe?" Jacob knew it was Joseph's robe, and he knew what it meant, and he was so devastated he could not be comforted. This is just an awful situation. But rather than being outside of God's will, Joseph was exactly in the center of it. Okay, so that's chapter 37, but there's a lot more to talk about with Joseph's life. And while we're not going to look in depth for the next couple of chapters, I just want to give you a quick overview of the next chapter or two so that we could see how these pieces fit together. So if we go on, chapter 38 is about Judah and Tamar. That's not a good situation. I'll just leave it at that. Chapter 39 opens with Joseph in Egypt as a slave in the house of a man named Potiphar. Verse 1 tells us that Potiphar was a captain of Pharaoh's bodyguards. Verse 2 tells us that the Lord was with Joseph. It says, the Lord was with Joseph so that he became a successful man. And so because of Joseph's faithfulness, verse 3 says, the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. And halfway through verse 5 it says, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was on all that he owned, on all that Potiphar owned, in the house and in the field. And so God blessed all that Joseph did, and Potiphar was thrilled with him. The problem is, Potiphar's wife was also thrilled with him. And in the end of verse 6, it says, Joseph was a handsome man in form and appearance. And Potiphar's wife notices this. And in verse 7, she calls out to him to lie with her. But Joseph remains faithful, and he answers her in verse 8, Behold with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? Joseph's answer was clear. He had no interest in her designs. First, it dishonored his master, but even more importantly, Joseph did not want to sin against the Lord. Now, sometimes people will stand against temptation for the first time or two, but they eventually break down. Not so with Joseph. And verse 10 says, As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or to be with her. So Joseph is a young man seeking purity. But in verse 12, she grabs hold of him, and he flees, and she rips off his garment, and that moment makes it crystal clear she will not break his willpower. And so she gets angry, and so she can't have what she wants, she seeks to destroy him. So she cries out, and everyone rushes in, and she falsely accuses Joseph. Now, this is a bad situation. Joseph's just a Hebrew slave. He's a nobody, and he's been accused of attacking the wife of his master. That would have meant certain death. But the Lord protected him. In verse 19, it says that when Potiphar heard what happened, his anger burned. But notice it doesn't say who it burned against. If it had burned against Joseph, Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard, would have certainly had Joseph cut down on the spot. Instead, Potiphar throws Joseph in prison. Many scholars think that Potiphar knew his wife was the problem. And so chapter 39 ends with Joseph now in prison. But it ends saying in verse 21, But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the jailer. And so the Lord was with Joseph even in prison. And verse 21 says that God extended kindness to him. Now, few people would think that this situation reflected God's kindness. Many who have gone through far less would question the goodness and the kindness of the Lord. And yet we'll see as we look at the next half of Joseph's life tomorrow that God had a good and wise plan for why Joseph was in Egypt. Joseph's journey to Egypt is the means by which God would preserve his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all their descendants. And so, although chapter 39 closes with Joseph in prison, we know that God's kindness is still being poured out upon him. Now that's chapter 37 with a smattering of chapter 39, and as we end our time together today, I'm sure that every one of us can think of times in our own life where things didn't work out the way we hoped. We may not fully understand the reasons for why things go the way they do, and like Joseph at the end of chapter 39, he definitely didn't know why things were the way they were. But ultimately, God had a good and wise plan for Joseph's life, and he has a good and wise plan for our life too. And so how about we end our time today thanking God for his kindness to us in all things, and just telling him that we trust him for the things that he's allowed into our lives, even when we don't fully understand them. Well, so we'll end on that note. Thanks for listening. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day, and God bless. As you know, I've written a study guide on the book of Genesis that's available on Amazon, and I'd like to announce a way you can get this book for free. You see, I wrote this book to help God's people better understand God's message. But I realize there are people who are listening to this podcast from around the world, and the book might not be available to them for various reasons. And so I'm pleased to say that you can now get nearly the entire book for free as a devotional guide on the YouVersion Bible app. It's got nearly everything there, just as missing the opening material and the closing material. If you go to their plans section and you search for key chapters of Genesis, this book should just come right up as one of their plans. You can just read almost the whole thing again for free. Now, you might be wondering, what is the YouVersion Bible app? That's actually the app that comes up first when you search for Bible in the Android and iTunes app stores. I think they're always first, and as a couple of years ago, they were on over 450 million devices, and so you may have seen it, and you may have even already had it installed on your phone, and in fact, you might have heard of this podcast through there because for a while they had a podcast section. We were one of the 15 podcasts that they would support. It's got that little logo. It's a maroon Bible that says Holy Bible in it, and so it's super common, might be on your phone already. Anyway, if you open the app, they've got a little section on the bottom called plans for like reading plans, devotional plans, things like that. It covers a variety of material. And if you go to their plans section and you search for key chapters of Genesis, the book should come right on up. So again, it's almost the whole book for free. You don't have to live in America or even buy the book to benefit from it. It's available on YouVersion for free. Or of course, it's also still available on Amazon as well if you want to have it in print form. I hope you check it on out, and thank you to everyone who has bought the book already. I hope it's been a blessing to you. Thanks again. Have a great day, and God bless.